Welcome to the Callie Chronicles. This is going to be the next to the last episode in this year's series of the Callie Chronicles. We got 4 tracks on today's episode, and then we're going to wrap things up with the final 6 or 7, I'm not sure how many there were, tracks. And you're going to like the next one, the finale, because we have several recoveries and then an interesting track that I think you guys will all enjoy. Today we're going to cover 4 tracks, tracks 21 through 24. And I'll briefly go over the first 3 tracks and then we'll get to the track 24. So let's get started. Track 21, and this track here was a very old track. It was approaching 40 hours in age since the hunter shot the deer. And there was only one reason I took this track, and that's because I had another track to take nearby, just a few miles away. So I agreed to come out there with Callie, and I didn't have high hopes of actually being able to track the deer. The main purpose of bringing Callie out there was to win the area where the hunter lost blood and kind of grid search with her nose, because she's capable of searching a larger swath as we make our sweeps through there with her nose. You know, she can smell a deer 7,500 yards away as we walk, where a grid searcher just using their eyes would have to cover a lot more ground. So we can cover a lot of ground in a lot less amount of time. So that's what I did. I brought Callie out there and we took her to last blood, and she actually seemed to be tracking. She was following right where the hunter had followed the blood trail. We gridded this, it was a big marsh, gridded this area, checked a couple islands, and we didn't come up with any additional sign. Now a little update on this track. I can't remember how much later. Yeah, it was the next day actually. The hunter got a hold of me. The same day we had tracked, the hunter went back in there and hunted his stand again that evening. And he says with a fair amount of certainty that he saw the same deer that he shot nearly 40 hours earlier. He wasn't able to get a shot on it again, but he said it looked fine, and he's pretty certain it was the same buck. All right, track 22. The hunter thought he made a good shot on this deer, maybe just a little bit back. He gave it a little bit of time and he tracked the deer. He ended up jumping the deer and watched it run off into a cattail marsh, and he said it looked like it was struggling a little bit, but as I told the hunter, it may have just been the deer trying to get through that cattail marsh or bog is what it kind of was, because when we were out there tracking, it was very difficult to walk in. So that could have gave the hunter the impression the deer was struggling to move. But brought Callie in there almost 25 hours later, and I tried to avoid tracks over 24 hours in age. That's kind of my cutoff point, 24, 26 hours. Sometimes we'll take them, like the 40-hour-old track, we'll take it just because we're in the area. But the problem with a track that old, if the hunter is just calling me at that point, then he's probably done a lot of bad things to the track to decrease our odds of recovery. You should know within the first 5 or 6 hours whether you need a dog on that track. If you have to back out because you made a bad hit, you need a dog, if you can afford it. Like I've mentioned in other videos, trackers don't charge a whole lot in most cases. A lot of them just take gas money or tips. Now there are some that charge $200-$300 or more. But if you know your local tracker and know he only charges 30 or 40 bucks for fuel or whatever his troubles to come out, it's well worth it. And then if you have to, you decide to back out and you're just going to look the next morning, which is fine. But then you spend another 6 or 8 hours out there searching during the day, and then now you're approaching 24 hours since you shot the deer, and then you decide to get a tracker on it. Well, you made a mistake initially. You should have had a tracker on it to begin with, or shortly after you started searching again that next morning. After an hour of tracking or an hour or two and you didn't find anything, you should have been calling tracker, not wait until that evening. And now you've got to find a tracker that's available, and he's likely going to be coming there in the dark, which hurts our ability sometimes. It's much better to be able to track in daylight to see what you're getting into, and the track is much older. The scent trail is much older for the dog. So I try to limit to that time frame, and that's kind of pushing it. I know it takes a little time to figure out whether you need to get a dog or not, and there's other logistic problems to overcome, but for the most part, you should know within 6 hours in most instances whether you need a dog or not. Anyway, so we put Callie on this track. I know I got a little sidetracked there, no pun intended. But we put Callie on this track, and we began tracking where the hunter last saw the deer out in the cattail marsh. And Callie immediately led me to a small island, and then she began barking and pulling. I stopped her and brought her back to the island. Went from there again. I saw a bed, but I didn't see any blood in it, and went off tracking again. The hunter radioed back to me that he found another bed on that island, and it had blood on it. So now we knew we were actually on the deer. The deer had bedded on the island. We continued tracking. We searched an enormous amount of area, much more than I typically do. But you know, it was I don't know what it was about this track. I just felt like it wasn't a difficult area to search. There were some small islands and cattail marshes with trails. Just I don't know, for some reason I made the decision to track it longer than I should have or normally do. But we never came up with a deer, and I theorized that it was indeed, it may have been a lethal hit, but it didn't die soon enough for us to recover it. So I haven't heard back from that hunter whether he saw that deer again or got it on trail camera. So for now, that deer is just a non-recovery. All right, let's jump over to track 23. The hunter said he was fairly sure that he hit far enough back that he lightly hit the liver on this deer. It was clean pass through. He tracked the deer probably about 100 yards, and the blood started getting spotty, so he called me in there. So I arrived 10 hours after he shot the deer. The hunter, actually in this case, I think made the right decision. You know, he tracked it, and you know, after he gave it some time. And then he got a hold of me. I think I was at work this day, and so I was not able to get out there until later in the afternoon. So that's why it was 10 hours, or that night rather. So anyway, I put Callie on the track. She took us in one direction, which we later found out was the correct direction. Without any further sign, I brought her back, restarted, and she kind of wandered off on several other directions. We brought her back again, and she took us in the direction she initially took. And that's where the hunter's wife spotted some more blood, and we knew we were in the right direction. And then we saw the arrow laid on the ground, so you know, even more evidence. The problem with this spot, there was a hog wire type fence, one of those welded mesh fences, and it was a lot of trouble getting back and forth over that fence, trying to locate where the deer had crossed. We spent probably too much time in that spot. But anyway, I finally got Callie over it and decided just to let her roam off. We got permission from the neighbors to check on their property. And after some searching, we finally jumped what we think was the deer we were after. It wasn't far away from where we found the last blood and the arrow. And you could just smell it reeked of a rutting buck, that aroma, you know what I mean.
You smell it? You smell it, girl? You smell it? You smell it? Come here, come here. Come here. Come here, come here, come. Up here. Come.
We didn't find any blood where the deer jumped up. Well, I didn't. I wasn't able to search. As soon as the deer jumped up and ran off in the dark, Callie went ballistic and was trying to follow this deer, and it took every bit of my strength just to pull her back off this track. The hunter and his wife went back in there. I marked the area with tissue, and they looked around, couldn't find any beds or any blood, and so they weren't totally convinced it was the deer we were after. But anyway, I had to leave to go to another track. They continued searching, and to the best of my knowledge, they never recovered this deer. So another non-recovery there. All right, let's move on to track 24. So the hunter shot this deer 12 hours before I arrived. So I think he shot it that morning. And he watched the deer run a short distance and then stop. He could see it was bleeding. The deer stood there for a little while, then it bedded down. And then after a little while, the deer got up and walked off. So I think they tracked it another 100 yards past where the deer initially bedded, and then they backed out and called me, which was a smart move, you know, especially seeing a deer lay down and then get back up. You know, it wasn't one of those quick lethal shots that puts them down within less than a minute. Obviously, this deer was probably hit liver or something, or guts, or back of the lungs or something like that, that it didn't kill it quick enough. So anyway, we get in there, and this is a point I want to make to a lot of people. When I know a lot of people don't like to mark their blood trail for whatever reason. I've been guilty of it when I'm tracking deer, not marking the blood with tissue. But one thing you almost always, or you should always do, is mark last blood with something, and not a camouflage hat, and not twigs in the woods or things like that. Mark it with something bright and it's easy to locate. Maybe tie something on a limb above last blood, because like in this case, nothing was marked. We had to go in there and find it in the dark, and we spent a half hour just looking for last blood, just to start the track, wasting a lot of time. We eventually found the blood trail, so we just kind of backed up and found it, and it started from there. Took me a little bit to get Callie locked on, but once I did, she was on the deer, and all I had to do was follow her. Easy. I got a bunch of blood down here. Come on, girl. Hold on. Hold on. More blood. Easy, girl. Trying to mark stuff. It look like blood, yeah. I'm still finding blood way down here. Come here, girl. Come here. Come here. Come here. Come here. Good girl.
found your deer still alive.
So I spotted this deer laying up on the hill. I could see its eyes reflected in my light, and so I went back to the hunter and told him where the deer was at. Because it was still alive, I basically gave the hunter the location, dropped a pin on the map where the deer was at, told him to go back in there the next morning. If the deer wasn't in that bed where we saw it, I felt for sure that it would be within 100 yards of that location. If it got up because of me and Callie, and then when I saw it, I just turned around and walked away. It may have gotten up and walked off. I didn't know. I was hoping it would stay there. As it turns out, the hunter went back in there the next morning. The deer had indeed moved off about 75 yards away from where Callie and I were at. And that's what I told him. I said the deer most likely went directly away from us. It didn't go at an angle. Most of the times they get up and go away from the threat. And so I said, if you just walk, a direction directly away from where we approached, that's where you'll find the deer. And sure enough, he found it 75 yards away. So a recovery there, and the deer was indeed hit back towards the liver in that area. And so at least we got the recovery, and the meat was still good, and the coyotes hadn't gotten it. So yeah, one more episode of the Callie Chronicles coming up. It's going to be a good one. We got about, 3 recoveries, 7 tracks to discuss. One of those tracks gets a little hairy, so you don't want to miss it. And I guess we'll see you guys all on the next episode of the Callie Chronicles.